Hi class, welcome to grade 11 biology. Maybe not the start we thought we were going to have, but we'll kind of make the best of online learning. So we are going to start with the diversity unit and have it wrapped up by the end of the week with tests through D2L on Friday. So when we're talking about diversity, it kind of linked in with a little bit. We talked about diversity in grade 9 with your biodiversity of ecosystems. We're going to kind of shift and look a little bit more at your different kingdoms, phylums, and things like that. So in order to understand diversity, we need to understand if something is living or non-living. So take a minute, try to see if you can determine from these 8 items, which items are living and non-living. Okay, so we have humans, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi. They are going to be what's living. How did you come up with why those 5 are living and the other 3 aren't? They have to satisfy what's known as the basic characteristics of life. So all organisms are composed of cells. They need to grow and repair cells, so replace cells. They need to be able to reproduce offsprings. They need to use energy, so that's why we have our metabolism. They need to produce waste through like your excretion, releasing of carbon dioxide, things like that. They also need to respond to a stimulus, and what's maintaining is homeostasis. And what homeostasis is, it's the balance in our body. So making sure that our body temperature doesn't go out of a specific range, same with our pH and things like that. And then adapt or evolve for the environment around us. So if a species is able to satisfy this, that is what's considered living. So what is an actual species? There's a few different variations to what a species is. A lot want to say species that look the same, but if you actually look at all the different dog breeds, they don't look that much similar, some of them. Like if you look at English Bulldog to a Golden Retriever to a Yorkie, they look very different, but yet they are all considered the same species. Where if you have a horse and a donkey, they're going to look actually more similar than the different breeds of dogs, but they are different species. And why they are different species is because that when they have an offspring, it's known as a mule, and a mule is not fertile. So in order for something to be considered a species, the most widely accepted definition is that they can produce a viable fertile offspring. That is kind of the main thing, so that that offspring is able to keep reproducing and having more babies. So if you take a crossbreed of dogs, I'll use mine. I have a Jack Russell Pug. It's a jug. He is able to have offsprings. But when you have the donkey and a horse, you get a mule. That mule is unable to have offsprings. So that's kind of the one big thing, how to tell is if it's able to have offsprings. When you look at single cell species that reproduce asexually, so like your bacteria, they don't kind of fit in this classification of what a species is based on how they produce their offspring. So this is where you'll look more maybe at genetics, or do they look similar and things like that. So now that we know what your species are, we need to look at what biodiversity is, and that's just the variety and number of species within an ecosystem. So when you think of biodiversity, you're going to kind of look at an area that's going to have lots of different species, specifically closer to the equator. So your rainforests are going to have a lot more variety of species than if you're looking at the Arctic or the Antarctic because of the cooler temperature. If you think of the Amazon, it's going to have lots of layers of forestry that help support lots of different species. And that's what's known as structural diversity, because it can support species of all different ranges and sizes. We need to be concerned because you're starting to see a huge decline in your biodiversity, and that's putting a lot of things at risk. We have food supplies, medicine, it's going to disrupt different cycles. You're getting forestries getting affected, so that we need to always kind of be concerned with what's happening with the species around us. When we're talking about species, we need to be able to classify them properly and name them properly so that we know two things that look alike aren't necessarily the same species. There's the monarch butterfly and the viscera butterfly. They look alike, but they are not the same species. And so how we're able to tell that is through called taxonomy, which is a classification system which was created by Linnaeus in 1707. Nowadays we have a little bit more ability to figure out if two species are related because of technology. But originally they were based on structural similarities and through evolutionary relationships through your fossil records. Now we add in the modern genetics. So looking at your DNA sequencing to see if you are similar to another species or within that same species. Humans are like 99.9% similar to each other. So that's how they know we are all part of the Homo sapiens species. And then embryology is where they look at the development of an offspring from the early stages of fertilization until about the 64 ball of cell stage. And you can keep going, but you can really see species that are closely related are going to be very similar in how they develop early on. Once you have your species, it has a scientific name and a common name. So we are humans, but that is not our scientific name. It is Homo sapiens. And how do they actually come up with this? So the first part of the name is the genus. The second part is the species. So we are part of the Homo genus. Sapien is our species names. When you are writing it, you are going to capitalize the genus, but not the species. And you either are going to italicize it or underline it so that you kind of can see the difference. Most of them are going to be in Latin because that was the language that most scientists use. And it's kind of similar if you took chemistry already, and even if you know from 9 and 10, a lot of the names on the periodic table are in Latin because that was the language that was used in early science. Okay, so now we know how we name those two species. What's a way to help distinguish the difference of two species if they even look similar or a little bit different? It's what's known as a dichotomous key. It's a way to determine if two species are the same species or different species. If you take any sort of zoology animal studies in post-secondary, you will be able to use this. Okay, so it's a way of figuring out the species with answering a question that has a very specific two answers. And then you have a new question with a very specific set of two answers. And you kind of work your way through that. So there's one in the note, and then there's also one in the worksheet. This one's a little bit more science-based. The one in the worksheet's kind of fun little minion one. So if we're looking at the very first one, so we have your leaf A. You need to look and say, okay, is it a needle leaf or a non-needle leaves? So now we know it's a non-needle leaves. We're going to go to step 3. And then it says, okay, it's simple leaf or a compound leaf. Okay, so is it single or made up? So it's a single. So now we go on to step 4. So you're going to go to 4 and it's got your smooth edge. So now it says go to 5 and the leaf edge is smooth. We know this is a magnolia. Okay, so what I'd like for you to do is to pause the video and try to work through C to H and see if you can determine each one of them. Okay, so now kind of check your answers and see how you did with your dichotomous key. And then there's another practice in the worksheet, but again, that's more of a kind of a fun little minion one. So now that we kind of know how to identify two different species, we know how to name it with genus and species, what other classifications can help to look at grouping of species similar together? So when we're looking at your taxonomy, you're going to be kind of ordering it kind of in a hierarchy. And so how you would look at a species is it would be classified as a domain, then a kingdom, then a phylum, a class, order, family, genus, and species. And as you go down to the species, the number of organisms become less because the characteristics are more specific. So you're going to have a lot of species in a kingdom and very few when you get to the species. So that's where you're kind of looking at it, that you're getting much more specific in the characteristics as you move through these taxon. So for us, we are in the kingdom Animalia. We are chordata, which means we have a spinal cord. We are mammals, primates, hominid, Homo sapiens. And so that's our entire classification using your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Let's just kind of look at a little bit of a couple of exercises. This one I don't think's in your note, but it's just kind of explaining it. So when you're looking at these are both versions of kind of a cat. You have a house cat and a bobcat. They are both in the same genus, but they are going to be in different species. Then you're looking kind of here, you have the lions added in with all your different cats. They are now going to be in the same family, but these guys are all going to be different genus and species. Now we're getting less specific and we're looking at your order, which is your carnivora, which now you're looking, you have kind of the dogs, your bears, they're all going to be in the different order. Then your class is your mammalia, and so that's where we fall under. Then you get into your chordata, your phylums, and the kingdom Animalia. And so we're going to look at what specifically makes up these different kingdoms. So before we get into the different kingdoms, there's a different classification that will happen first, and that's what's known as your domains. And so this breaks down, there's only 3 domains. You have your bacteria, your archaea, and your eukarya. The protists, fungi, plants, and animals all fall under the eukarya, and that has to do with the structure of your cells. So when you think of cells, you have your prokaryotes, eukaryotes. You might have learned about that in your grade 10 science, and if not, that's okay. So when you have your prokaryotic cell, the main thing that prokaryotes do not have is they lack the nucleus. So their genetic information is just kind of out there. You can see the DNA. They don't have a nuclear membrane that surrounds the DNA and kind of keeps it inside and safe. Okay, that's one of the biggest difference between them. They also don't have membrane-bound organelles like we do with your mitochondria and your chloroplast. So when you're looking at your eukaryotes, now you can see you have those nuclei in those internal membranes. You have your nucleus here. You have your mitochondria there. And because this is an animal cell, you won't see your chloroplast. But if it was a plant cell, it would have in there. Okay. Primarily, you'll see your prokaryotes. This is going to be your bacteria and your archaea, and we'll talk about it eventually. And then your eukaryotes will get all into those other kingdoms. Kind of just your separation, so you know. You have your different species we've kind of mentioned. They are usually, prokaryotic cells are going to be smaller than your eukaryotes. DNA is more circular and not membrane bound. We and other species in the eukaryotic kingdom are going to have multiple chromosomes. You kind of might have learned a little bit about chromosomes in mitosis. We're going to go through it again the second week we're back when we get into our genetics unit. Our cells will do mitosis and meiosis and usually form through sexual reproductions, but depending on which ones you're specifically looking at. Most eukaryotic cells are aerobic, which means we require oxygen to survive. So even your little fungi and protists are going to need oxygen. Bacteria can be anaerobic or aerobic. So there's a little bit difference between those. Okay. When we classify a species as either bacteria, archaea, or eukaryotes, then we can classify it again even further in what's known as your kingdoms. So this is where you have your bacteria, archaea, and then this is your eukarya. Those 4 are going to be your eukarya: plants, animal, fungi, and protists. We're going to look at each one of these specifically in their own notes. But if you kind of look over time, originally it was thought we just had animal and plants. Then these protists came about and eventually bacteria, and then they realized that the fungi were very different than plants, and so they were able to separate them, and then came the discovery of these archaea. The reason they came so much later is because they live in extreme environments, and we'll go through that a little bit more in another note. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the first note. There's the worksheet that goes along with it, and then when you're done that, you can move on to the next note, which is going to be your viruses, which actually doesn't fall into a kingdom because they are considered non-living. Okay, all right, thanks for listening, class.